Our second reading actually comes out of Isaiah as well. What Sheila read earlier sort of paints the picture of what is, and Isaiah wants to continue to talk less about what is and more about what will be. So he is going to present something called the peaceful kingdom, something that we have labeled his description of what is to come. In your bulletins, it says, I'll read chapter 11, 1 to 5, but I'm actually going to read through 9, 1 to 9. It gives you a fuller picture of what it is that that Isaiah thinks is coming, Jesus is coming, and what that is exactly going to look like. Listen to a word from our Lord. Isaiah says that there's a shoot. It's going to come out of the stump of Jesse. There's going to be a branch that's going to grow out of those roots, and the Spirit of the Lord is going to rest on that person. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge all of the poor, decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and the breath of his lips. He's going to kill the wicked. Righteousness is going to be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. This is the image that you will see. The wolf will lie down with the lamb. The leopard is going to lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling all together, and a little child shall lead all of them. The cow and the bear, they're going to graze together, and their young are going to lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox do. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand into the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There's a poet, and her name is Ruth Stone. She was once asked, "How do you write your poems, Ruth?" She said that she actually began writing poetry as a small child. She lived in rural Virginia on a farm. She said that she would be out there picking whatever vegetable or crop was in season, and she would hear the wind, and she would feel it. And then suddenly it would turn into this rumbling, thunderous noise, and it would announce, "Ruth, a poem is coming." As soon as she heard and felt the wind, she would literally sprint to her house where she had left out paper and pen on the desk. If she was lucky, she made it into the house before it erupted into the house, she would say. She would then write it down what it said because it would say something to her ear. Sometimes she was distracted or she was too slow and didn't catch up to the poem on that wind in the house, and she said she could see it go through the back doors out the window, and she would grieve that another poet was going to get that poem, and then she would go back to work. Sometimes she would be in an all-out sprint with the wind, trying to catch it. She would be fumbling in her desk, trying to find the pencil and the paper because she hadn't left it out, and she would grab the poem by its tail, and she would pull it back. And as she pulled it back, she would write down what the poem said. She said that when she did this, she was writing as frantically as she possibly could, and then she would look at the end result of the poem, and it was written backwards, with the ending first. We all know the ending of God's story, don't we? Jesus is coming. That is the season that we are about to embark upon. Advent will start next Sunday. He's going to be crowned king later. That is the Sunday that we joined today, Christ the King. Peace, is supposed to reign throughout the world. Isaiah gives us the end of this story that I just read. He gives us some visualizations. There's a lamb lying with a lion. There's a child that rests near a snake. And there's a cow that grazes with the bear. These are the images of the reality of God's reign that is to come. But these are not true today. I cannot say that from this pulpit. None of us are putting our children anywhere near snakes. And the last time I checked, I don't know this for certain, but I don't think bear hunters take cows with them. And it is as if Isaiah has caught God's tail had brought back that story, only he wrote it backwards like Ruth Stone did. We know where it's going to end. We aren't really sure where it began. Maybe it began at creation, we say, when we were made in God's image like Adam and Eve. All was well in the garden, if we remember that original story. But then there was a disruption and later an expulsion. Then sin matured into death as we watched Kane kill his brother Abel. And it only has gotten worse from there. So maybe it started over with Noah when God flooded the entire world and said, "No more wickedness." Somehow wickedness found its way back into the world, and that didn't work. So maybe Abraham was the new beginning, and he came along and did well, but not that well. It was Joseph's turn, then Moses' turn, and then he died before he got to the promised land. But Joshua got to enter with the Israelites. They all did their best, but in the end, the people cried and moaned and whined, and they wanted a king. So they got Saul, and he didn't do that great, so that led to David. He led to Solomon, who led to a divided kingdom. And then finally, Christ came. That's what we will celebrate in a couple of weeks. Christ will be born as a child, and this is where the story begins, doesn't it? Christ changes everything. Just his birth changes everything, and a new course is set. Love will prevail, righteousness will reign, as Isaiah says, and that peaceful kingdom that he has proclaimed will come into existence. Except that it really didn't, did it? Death still stings, love can still hurt any one of us, and sin has continued to mature to levels that we are so afraid of. There are cynics among us. Sometimes I'm cynical. We fall victim to the perpetual onslaught of all the sadness, all the death, all the destruction, all the yelling. Do you know how much yelling there is in this world today? I thought about all of that. I thought about how cynical I can get if I'm around certain people or if I just allow myself to sit too long in a particular thought. I realized something while I was in Nashville, while we took some vacation and went back for a wedding. I realized that I find enormous hope in bookstores. There is one in particular. It's in Nashville. It's independently run by a local author. There are dogs. There are 2 dogs who, quote unquote, work there, although you're not allowed to let them outside. The walls are covered with books. It is beautiful. They even have one of those old ladders that you can slide up and down. You cannot climb it, though, unless you work there. The tables are also filled really, really high of books. Nonfiction, bestsellers, not so great sellers, new books, old books, children's books. I walked in there and I looked up. There were posters of old books, famous books, great writers, not so great writers. I felt like the world was at my fingertips. I felt like I was walking around the store and I was soaking in all of their ideas, all the creativity that they had come up with, all that the stories they told. They told about the world as we know it, some in the nonfiction world, but also some in the fiction world. But interspersed throughout all these stories were snippets, of something different. Maybe they were telling a love story. Maybe they were telling a story of hope or redemption, or maybe they were just telling a story of luck, the luck of the draw. But something invaded the world of destruction, the world of death, of guns and violence and broken dreams, and with those books seemed to announce to me when I was walking around there, this is not all there is. I'm not sure Isaiah knew where this story started. And I would be so bold as to stand before you and say that he probably doesn't really care. Where it started is not his point. He doesn't matter about that. What he matters about and what he is about is telling you God's story. And to him and to all the prophets and those that have spoken God's words before, they are trying to tell you God's story. But they want to tell you a specific reason for God's story, that it is leading you to God. What I do know is that Isaiah has caught God's tail and was not going to let go. Like Ruth Stone, the poet, he had run inside, he had grabbed his pencil and paper or whatever it is he wrote with in those days, and he simply would not relinquish what God had told him. He was going to write it down. But if you've read the whole book of Isaiah, it's a crazy book. He does a lot of wild things. He didn't just write it down, he lived it. He proclaimed it. He talked to the kings, he talked to the lowly people, he talked to everyone, because he wanted the people to know where God was leading them. And we do too, don't we? We want to know what this whole church thing is about, what faith is about. We want to know where it is leading. We know some things, but we want to know something more. In the midst of our daily lives, where even the most mundane activities take up the bulk of our energy, we want something to interject into our lives and stir us up a little bit, don't we? While we are answering email after email after email, or changing diapers and making phone calls after phone calls and studying for tests that then follow papers that then follow pop quizzes, we want to be interrupted. We want something or someone to tell us, this is not all the world has to offer you. Isaiah was one of those interrupters. He wrote these words while he was living in Jerusalem, and here's a little bit about what was going on at that time. The Assyrian army, the greatest army ever known at that point in history, was closing in on the city. They had wide swaths of land. They would destroy anyone and everyone who stood in their way. So King Hezekiah, a descendant of David, is standing there in his kingdom and thinking to himself, I have got to do something. His first thought is to relinquish control, say, we will join with you, let us be who we are, and we'll just pledge allegiance to you, powerful Assyrians. Isaiah runs to him and tells him that's the worst idea he's ever heard. Do not profess faith in anyone but God. God is more powerful than anything any army has ever known. He convinces Hezekiah not to join with the Assyrians, and they do end up staving off the Assyrians. Still, death and destruction are all around King Hezekiah. Yes, the kingdom stood, but the people are still dying. The morale is low. They're calling for his head and his job. And the sin, that sin was rampant everywhere. It made me think about the fact that the names have changed, the leaders have changed, but that description sounds like today, doesn't it? Yes, our kingdom still stands, whether we think of the kingdom as the church or our government, but they aren't functioning well. Well, it depends on which side of the debate you're on. Just look at the news. While I was out of town, so much death and destruction happened. We can see it all over our world. In the church world, you can see or you hear a church closed. Another pastor failed miserably. We see our leaders then trying to step up and lead us, only to watch them fail. And you know what that does to us? It makes our morale plummet. And when morale is low, we start to look for a good solution. We start to look for people or institutions or curriculums or something amazing that is going to solve our issues. Most of the time, we look to history, because history is going to tell us something. If it worked for them, it might work for us. If it didn't work for them, then we know why it didn't work for them, so we'll do something different. The past is instructive. But why don't we ever look to the future? I thought about Ruth Stone a lot this week, mainly because we were driving back and forth to the farm where we were staying, and it was filled with farmland. It's out in the country, it's filled with fields. I even wondered, I'm not going to lie to you, if I should walk amongst those fields, hoping that the wind would pick up, that I would feel that thunderous rumble of a poem that Ruth Stone talked about, and it would blow my way, and I would run inside and write it down. My excuse was that the fields were barren, and I didn't really want to get out there and mess up my new shoes. Also, it was horse farm, so I wasn't sure if it translated well, so I stayed inside. But I did stare intently at those fields. Particularly on Wednesday afternoon, this past Wednesday. Phoebe was napping on my shoulder, and I was in my parents' house, and they live in this house that overlooks a bluff. It's actually on a bluff, and it overlooks a river, and then there's beautiful pastoral lands just beyond it. Cows are walking around. My mom was holding Phoebe as she dozed in and out of sleep, and she needed to go get dinner started, so I scooped up Phoebe and put her on my shoulder so that she could continue to sleep. Then I closed my eyes and I felt the wind kind of pick up. My mom had opened the door because it was a beautiful day. I didn't have a pencil or paper. I have the modern version of that. I had my phone. I felt Phoebe's breath rising and falling with each time the wind blew. I sensed her story was unfolding all around me, and I was holding on for dear life. In 5 short months, I hadn't really realized this. You don't realize this until you're around family or friends who haven't seen your daughter or your kid for a while. I hadn't realized that she's developed and grown so much. Yeah, she looks like she did earlier today, I would tell them. No, she's changed dramatically. She's 5 months old already. That seems so short, but also so long. I hadn't realized all of that. I wanted to just hold on to that sweet, sleeping baby, but her story was unfolding. And at that moment, I realized I was going to do well if I could just hold on to her tail. Much of life is attempting to hold on to whatever the wind blows, isn't it? Trying to grasp what God is doing in our lives. Sometimes we are too slow. Sometimes we run into the house like Ruth Stone and we watch as the wind continues to blow. We grieve that we missed that opportunity. We missed that poem. Other times we capture it very easily. We write it down. Everything makes sense. We have found the person of our dreams to marry. We have found the perfect job. We have found the perfect church. And all is well. It makes sense. Other times we rush frantically into the house and we grab the poem by the tail and we pull it back and we write it down with whatever we can and we spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out what it means. Maybe that's what the church is doing. Maybe that's what you are doing in your own life. All 3 of those things happen every day to each of us and in this community. It's God. It is God blowing into our lives, reminding us of the hope. For me, I find hope in bookstores. I don't know what you find hope in, but I would encourage you to think. Where is the wind blowing you? What is God blowing on that wind to you? And here is what I will tell you. The wind is blowing you somewhere, and it is blowing you into a future that God has already created, and it is waiting for each of us. May God bless this witness, and may God bless this congregation. Amen.